Hello, I'm Joe Furia, Executive Director of World Forestry Center, and welcome to the 5th episode of Adapting to the Era of Megafires, a community and expert summit on catastrophic wildfire in Oregon and beyond. This episode has 2 parts. Today in part 1, our co-hosts will be joined by nonprofit leaders who are harnessing the power of public-private partnerships to develop solutions in wildfire, water, and climate change. Tomorrow in part 2, our co-hosts will be joined by leaders at the state and federal level to discuss how we can take action to adapt to the era of megafires. With no further ado, we present part 1 of episode 5, Building a Movement and Implementing Solutions.
The numbers associated with these fires are just mind-blowing.
It's the most destructive fire in state history.
Now California's largest wildfire.
This fire has become the largest and deadliest fire in state history.
The mayor says she thinks 90% of her town is gone.
This fire is burning the equivalent of a football field every second.
Part of the challenge with megafires in California is that we need to break this cycle, and breaking that cycle happens through active management of our forests, thinning out forests so that they don't burn as severely. It includes land use reform, so we don't put homes in harm's way over and over again, and acting quickly is necessary because over time these are going to get worse with climate change.
Climate change is a wildfire threat multiplier, both here in California and elsewhere. Our climate is still warming, and so that's why it's so important to really be thinking in a comprehensive way about what we can do to address it.
Our natural and working lands are really in crisis. Trees are one of the only ways that we have to pull carbon out of the air, and so they have to be an important part of our solution.
Wildfires in California are nothing new. They've been part of the natural history of this region for thousands of years. But what we've seen in the last couple of years is really a step above. We've seen wildfires that have burned far larger swaths of land far more quickly than we had seen in the 20th and early 21st century.
With all of the wildfires that we had in this fall and last fall, what you saw is this giant spread of smoke, not just in the areas that the fires happened, but spreading all over the region. It was unbelievable how thick the smoke was. We've been on this trend where we've experienced the most fires, the biggest fires, the most severe fires. It's time for us to start making a different kind of history. It's time for us to find the solutions.
I just sort of back up to, this is a generational problem, right? We created it over generations, and so it's going to take generations to fix it.
But it's important to understand that there is a solution if we can just marshal the resources to get the work done.
In terms of the frequent fire landscapes where we have created these unnatural accumulations of fuels, we certainly have the opportunity to do restoration in these, but we can't simply put fire back into them. Most of them, because it's been so long now since there's been fire in these, the accumulations of fuels are so great that we would not be able to control a fire if we tried to put fire back into those, and everything would burn up just as it does with a wildfire. So what we need to do in many of these environments is in fact go in and begin by mechanically reducing those fuels by saw and the axe and removing that material where we can in order to help pay for the treatment that we're doing. Then it becomes possible to reintroduce fire or allow fire to reintroduce itself in those.
You know, we want old growth and we want robust communities. Those are things that we all want, and there is a way to get there. We need to be doing a lot more restoration, which does include thinning and prescribed fire, than we are. The need is great, and we will never get there at the pace that we're going. There are a lot of barriers. The first is funding and staffing for the Forest Service. Forest Service is the biggest landowner in Eastern Oregon. They are not funded by Congress, and they are not staffed appropriately to put these kinds of projects together. They simply just don't have the money, and they don't have the people to do it.
The Forest Service estimates that 80 million acres of its 193 million acre land base is in need of some sort of restoration because it is at risk of catastrophic wildfire or insect and disease outbreaks. We need to be focusing on a restoration economy and approach, and we need to be making sure that we can reduce the wildfires that we've seen and protect our homes and our communities and the resources we care about. But that's not to suggest it's going to be an easy fix. A lot of the material that comes off of these forests is very small, it is very low value, and there's a lack of markets for it. So we are going to need to continue to have innovation and investment to make sure that we can remove that material for environmental purposes, not just for markets and economies.
We're talking about millions of acres of problems, which means millions and millions of tons of material that need to come out. We need scalable solutions.
The neat thing here is we know what to do. It's just a question of whether we have the will to do it.
The last 20 years, I've been trying to figure out how water really works and how it can work. In those couple of decades, I've seen the tactics that used to work become somewhat obsolete given the problems we've got. Conservation's hit a wall, and what we got to do now is figure out how do we get over it, around it, through it, under it, but we can't stop here. My grandpa just wanted the economy and the environment to work together. So if he took care of the land, it would take care of him. That's not how it worked out. We have got to change in order to make sure that the economy and the environment are working together as one. That's going to mean recalibrating how we think of the problem. It's going to mean changing how we track effort, and it's going to be crucial that we make investments that really allow us environmental gain. The compelling piece to me about all of this is we can fix this. We know what we have to do. We know how we can do it. So let's just get on it.
Hello, and welcome back to our 5-part series, Adapting to the Era of Megafire. I'm Matt Donegan, Chair of the Oregon Wildfire Council, and our series is based on the work of the Wildfire Council, which convened over the course of 2019 and produced a comprehensive wildfire strategy for Oregon. The 3 main takeaways of our strategy is, number 1, the comprehensive costs of wildfire are far greater to our state than we commonly recognize, and we have specific implications and costs to our most vulnerable communities. So there are widespread social justice implications to wildfire. Second one is that we do have a strategy, and the strategy is based upon decades of best practices and research, and indeed millennia of best practices coming from our indigenous communities. So we have a lot to draw from. We're not caught flat-footed, which brings me to number 3, our third takeaway from our strategy, which is that we need to step up and really implement our strategy at the scale and the complexity at which we face this challenge. The times have changed. We've entered a new era, and we need to change with it. So in this 5-part series, in episode 1, we brought in experts that talked about the causes and consequences of wildfire. And there's really 3 there. One is climate change. The second is we've just distorted our ecosystems, and we now have far greater vegetation than we would typically have. And then the third cause is that we've also built our communities right into fire-prone areas. And so we identified those consequences and causes of wildfire, which then introduced episodes 2, 3, and 4, which presented the strategies. In episode 2, we talked about how do we build fire-adapted communities in this new era. In episode 3, we talked about how do we restore our landscapes to fire resilience to address this threat. And then in episode 4, we talked about how do we protect our firefighters. We're sending them into ever greater harm's way in this new era, and how do we equip them to face this challenge. And so with that, I'd like to welcome back my two co-hosts, Katrina Holland and Charles Wilhoite. Katrina is on the Wildfire Council as well. She also leads JOIN, which is a homeless service agency here in Portland. Charles Wilhoite also serves on the Wildfire Council, and he is managing director with Willamette Management Associates, which is a wealth management firm. Katrina and Charles, welcome back.
Good to see you, Matt.
Good morning.
Thanks for joining us again. So we just saw another moving clip of really what we're confronting here in this modern day. And I'm just curious as to what your reactions are now that you've had a chance to kind of get our heads back in the game and see what the issues are that we're addressing.
Well, there's some interesting parallels looking at environmental assets, and there is a very consistent set of themes. Joe Whitworth from the Freshwater Trust talked about water being one of our invisible assets or resources that affects our economy. And the theme that Joe brings up relates to the notion that times have changed and we have to change how we deal with our resources. And that's consistent when we look at forest restoration. So he's talking about taking care of an asset. That asset is part of our economy necessarily, and the economy and the environment have to work together. And that's really what we're talking about with regard to restoration of our forest. Edie Chang of California Resources Board, she talked about the fact that trees are one of the only ways or main ways that carbon is pulled out of our air. And when you think about that, uncontrolled wildfire or catastrophic wildfire results in the release of extreme amounts of carbon. And that's really why we're talking about this issue. We need to take care of the environment. We need to take care of the people and assets. And we have to do this in a very strategic manner, which brings me to a key point made in the video that I saw. There's a gentleman who talked about we need to use the material, i.e. the tree resources themselves, for treatment. And he was really addressing the notion that because we have let fuel build up to such a high level, we can't really introduce prescribed fire in certain areas. It would result in uncontrolled fire. So he's saying we have to be strategic in how we remove the asset and use the asset to take care and pay for that restoration or that activity. So the themes are consistent. The fuel buildup is out of control. We need to be innovative and creative. And I love the conclusion. It's forcing innovation in the forest products industry. Others are looking at how to use small diameter trees, which would come out of the forest as a result of mechanical thinning, in the creation of products that can go into creating and advancing the economy. So a lot of consistent themes, but the buildup of resources has become excessive. We have to be creative in how we deal with this. You know, one of the comments was we have 80 million acres of forest land that are subject to catastrophic fire, bug infestation, and disease. And that's out of about 190 million acres. So almost half is in that high risk category. We have to come up with solutions to address that, to preserve, once again, the forest, to preserve the economy, to protect lives. And we have to do this. So the themes are consistent. But I love the connection between looking at the water resource and the forest resource. Times have changed. We need to come up with innovative and strategic ways to address this. So that's what came out of the videos for me.
A couple of folks in the videos made it very clear over and over that, we do have the resources. We do have the ability to manage this situation effectively. It just requires will. And will is the one thing that makes me feel a little deflated, because with so many competing needs in our community right now, sort of the thought of mustering those resources seems like rolling a boulder up a giant hill. And we talked about that a lot at the Wildfire Council. So that's sort of the reactions that I had to that video.
I think the video did a lot to integrate a lot of the lessons that we've learned over the last 4 episodes. The fact that we're entering a new era. It's really beyond the capacity of our current economic structure, beyond the capacity of our current public policies. We need new policies to spawn a new economic structure. We talked about that in episode 3 a lot. This restoration economy that requires all sorts of collaboration between the public sector and the private sector. it is, I think, encouraging to see the innovation in other sectors and to recognize that we're not alone. President Biden talks about when he hears climate change, he hears jobs, he hears opportunity. And so there's going to be new fields of work. There's going to be new fields of study. You can see that in other sectors. And that's certainly the case here with wildfire. So as the globe is confronting similar challenges, I think this is an opportunity for Oregon to demonstrate leadership, develop some new technologies, develop new ways of approaching this challenge, and hopefully export those technologies and that expertise to other regions. So, which is, I think, a good segue just as we kind of start thinking about the upcoming conversations we're going to have. What are some of your thoughts as we come into this discussion around what do we need to implement at scale and complexity and really mobilize a social movement to make this the priority? As Katrina says, there's so many competing priorities. What are some of your thoughts as we come in today's discussion?
I think the most important thing we can do is create clear understanding of the relationship between forest preservation, forest restoration, our economy, social justice issues, and economic issues in general. Because if we consider all of the areas that forest restoration can impact, of course, we're focusing on taking care of lives and taking care of people, taking care of property, taking care of the environment. But when you think about it, all of those activities create opportunity to address other issues that are affecting society. If we talk about forest restoration, we're talking about creating a new segment of our economy or expanding an existing segment of our economy. We look at our rural communities, they are still recovering from the Great Recession, the financial meltdown in 2008, 2009, when we're hit by COVID. So they get a double whammy in a negative sense from an economic perspective, not to mention impact on their health. But when we think about that and we talk about forest restoration, it is potential for a new economy.
Yep.
We all know that disruption creates opportunity. We can talk about restoration and related activities, both with regard to our electricity grid and upgrading our water systems, our health systems. All of these create opportunity for job creation while they're taking care of lives and taking care of the environment. So I think the key is to make those connections, make it clear to people that it's not a singular activity or a singular objective that we're pursuing, but it's multiple objectives related to restoring and preserving our forest. And I think that's the key. I don't know how anyone can argue with that. So I hope people hear that message and we figure out how to connect those dots and get a lot of positives out of this effort.
It's an interesting hand that we're dealt here in Oregon. We've got a lot of advantages, and then we have some challenges to overcome. Some of the advantages, I think, it's the fact that if you look to the north, you look to the south, our neighbors are really embracing innovation. There's a lot to learn from what folks in California and Washington are doing. Same with a lot of the innovation that we see in climate, whether it's renewable energy, clean energy, or carbon capture, or water markets. We're going to hear from some of the other experts here. Portland's a hub of that type of activity, and not just Portland, but greater Oregon. So we've got some strong assets to work with. Also, we're going to hear about how other Western states largely lost their forest products industry. We have a very strong forest products industry. We have a great forestry school here. We have some assets that we can build off of. Now, we need to reorient this, this approach, and we need to reorient the sector towards ecological thinning and restoration and really public values. But we've got a lot to build off of. One disadvantage or challenge we have is that relative to our neighbors in particular, we've got a small economy. We've got a large state. We've got a big land mass. We have a lot of land that needs to get treated to deal with this. And we do have limited economic resources. And as we all know here, we've got competing demands for that. And so I think that really does, make it such that we really do have to be thoughtful about prioritizing our resources, but also how do we leverage our private sector partners so that we can scale up and confront this at the challenge of which we face it. I think we've got a great lineup. Very, very excited about what we have today. The content of episode 5 has been very robust, and as such, we've made the decision to break this into 2 segments. Part 1 of episode 5 will include a panel of 4 experts that will be discussing public-private partnerships and how do we use the collective resources of the public sector and the private sector to address a challenge of this magnitude. And then part 2 of episode 5 we will have conversations with a number of senior elected officials here in Oregon. In our next panel, we will drill down into the concept of partnership between the public and private sectors in order to address the complexity and the scale of wildfire here in Oregon. In doing so, we've invited renowned experts in 2 other environmental sectors, Joe Whitworth of the Freshwater Trust here in Portland and Dean Takahashi of the Yale University Carbon Containment Lab. We've also invited an expert in wildfire and forest restoration from California, Dan Porter of the Nature Conservancy. And we have welcomed back an expert in wildfire and forest restoration here in the Pacific Northwest, Nils Christoffersen from Wallowa Resources. Hello, everyone. And on behalf of my co-hosts, Katrina Holland, Charles Wilhoite, welcome to our program. Before we start our conversation, I'd like to just kind of go around and ask each of you just to give a little bit more of your background. Maybe I'll start with Nils.
Thanks, Matt. It's good to be here again this morning and with everybody else here. My name is Nils Christoffersen. I'm the executive director of Wallowa Resources, which is a community-based nonprofit in Wallowa County celebrating its 25th anniversary this year. And through Wallowa Resources, we've been engaged with forest restoration and rural community revitalization across Northeast Oregon, and increasingly in working to support this in the Intermountain West. It's great to be here today.
Thanks, Nils, for joining us. Next, maybe go around the horn and ask Dan with the Nature Conservancy.
Thanks, Matt. My name is Dan Porter. I am the Forest Program Director for the Nature Conservancy's California chapter. We have a variety of projects happening in California's Sierra Nevada, including ecological thinning, prescribed fire, and large-scale planning. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Dan. Next, Dean Takahashi.
Hi, I'm the founder and executive director of the Yale Carbon Containment Lab, which is part of the Yale School of the Environment. And I've come to this after more than 33 years helping to manage the Yale's endowment. And I'm very pleased to be here. Thanks.
Thanks for joining us, Dean. And lastly, Joe Whitworth with Freshwater Trust.
Joe Whitworth, President and CEO of the Freshwater Trust. We started out years ago as a fairly typical conservation outfit engaged in conservation policy and advocacy work. We listed several of the first Pacific salmon under the Endangered Species Act in conjunction with the Nez Perce and others. It was really about engaging in the kinds of efforts at the right place in the right amount, specifically around restoration, to ensure that the protections of the Act would no longer be required to protect those species because they got recovered. Over more recent times, we have begun to get focused on the intersection of innovation, technology, and finance so that we can accelerate the pace and scale of restoration.
Well, again, thanks to all of our guests for joining. Before we hear from our guests, I'll just give a little bit of context and kind of recap some of the lessons that we have that we've heard from our prior guests and our prior episodes. First and foremost, I think that at the most fundamental level, wildfire has changed. That is something that we've heard just consistently, expert after expert. It's changed, and it's going to continue in this direction. This is not a blip in the radar. This is something that we should expect actually to worsen in the years ahead. And we really talk about it as being an existential crisis, here in the Western U.S., particularly here in Oregon in the aftermath of the Labor Day fires. We've just seen such wreckage and such destruction. And this is a topic that certainly deserves our greatest attention, our greatest priority. It's got specific impacts on our most vulnerable communities of color, low-income communities, folks with health conditions. This is a topic where we have to rise to the challenge. And just like all things with climate change, it's just too big for the private sector or the public sector or for NGOs to tackle on their own. And we really need to work together. We need to do that in a very thoughtful way. It requires vision, it requires coordination. And so this panel is a panel that's got just that kind of experience and expertise working in very complex issues. And one of the things that we want to establish here is build something to last, build something that's sustainable. As an illustration, you think about forest restoration here in Oregon got a huge boost of activity back during the global financial crisis because we got a lot of stimulus, and then that money went away, and we retreated right back. And so we're in a similar situation right now with a lot of public funding available. We don't want to repeat that. We want to be able to take this as a springboard and build towards long-term sustainability. And build the programs that are going to invite in the private investment. The good news is there's a lot of private investment that wants to address this. And so this is a real moment in time and a real opportunity. So let's start with Joe Whitworth with the Freshwater Trust. And maybe, Joe, ask you to give us a case study or two that we might learn from in water. But before doing so, maybe talk about just at a kind of fundamental level, what are some of the key elements that you see on successful partnerships like we're talking about, and maybe some things that we want to avoid?
So thank you, Mr. Moderator, and a quick kudos to our conveners, as well as the World Forestry Center and its leadership with Joe Furia. I'm pretty excited to join such an august group. Because it's a group of innovators, and innovators innovate because they're doing the work over time, but they're not getting the results that they want. And so by seeing new things coming across in the field, that gives me hope that we're going to get there, because we're not just going to keep on doing more of the same. With regard to megafires, unless we change our approach pretty dramatically, these are the good old days, meaning, no one on this call is likely to ever again live in a year that is cooler than the year previous to it. And second, overgrown forests and avoidable wildfire has been a hidden part of our American life due to mismanaged forests for decades at this point. And, I would say this a little bit contra, right? 2020 was an absolutely great year. And it was great insofar as it laid bare, and I mean really bare, the reality of many of society's most unquestioned and established systems are simply no longer able to deal with the problems that they're purported to be addressing. And whether it's our healthcare systems, economic systems, social justice systems, and of course our ecosystems. And those failures being so easy and obvious for all to see really kind of gives us the green light to ditch the old patch and tinker our way around a problem, as we've done throughout our political and economic history, and fundamentally begin to redesign our approach. So just to be very clear, the answer is, let's not get the federal money cannon out and throw money at the problem, or just work harder the same way. We have to learn the lessons of the past and adjust so that we can create new mechanics. We have here in Oregon been able to do some great innovations. We're a small state. We are able to kind of get to decision makers and bring people together and do some things that a lot of other states can't quite do. One of those things that we've been able to do with regard to water has to do with green infrastructure, because we have figured out how to quantify environmental uplift into terms of a sort of a tradable unit or a transactional unit, whether that's a pound of phosphorus or a pound of nitrogen or a ton of sediment or, a temperature unit to cool a watershed, we can bring those together for those folks that have dollars with those folks that have access to the problem. And in the water world, truly, the biggest issue that we have is agricultural runoff. And it's largely unregulated under the Clean Water Act, but it really is the first best and cheapest way to achieve the outcomes that we're after. So we worked with a municipality in the south part of the state on the Rogue River, city of Medford, and we were able to provide them, they were looking at cooling their water, and they had to do that because all water that goes down any drain has to get treated, and in that treatment, it generally gets warmed up. And temperature is a pollutant under the Clean Water Act. So we have a policy driver there that requires each city, of which there are a couple 100,000 in the United States that are regulated in this way, they have to offset or treat that water in some way. In their case, they were going to dig a hole and let the treated water go down in there, wait for a few days, and then put it back into the Rogue system. That was going to deliver to them 300 million kilocalories or 300 million temperature units at a cost of around somewhere between $16 and $20 million. We were able to work with landowners and shade the watershed, deliver to them 600 million kilocalorie credits or 600 million watershed cooling credits, if you will, at a cost of around $6 million. And we were able to do that and then turn that $6 million into something of, I think, in the $20 to $25 million on the ground, which for us did several things. Not only did we meet the requirements of the Clean Water Act for that client at a vast savings, we put a bunch of locals to work. Businesses expanded, nursery businesses, restoration jobs expanded. We work with Loma Katsi, which is a tribal organization down there. And what we were able to do is focus the work in several subbasins that really made a difference. And we saw responses from those fish listed under the Endangered Species Act in a couple of these subbasins, 350%, 550%, and ultimately 16,000%, which is nuts and exactly what we were trying for. The problem with that is that success took a third-party organization like ours. We're a 501c3. We woke up every morning and we engaged in the old leverage, like go get a grant here, get a grant there, put the money down. We were driving everything, and that's not sustainable. In order to do this at scale, certainly in the water space, but I would wager within the forest treatment space, we have to have advanced watershed analytics. We need to X-ray the entire watershed and know where to work. We need to have coordinated effort so that everybody is operating from the same sheet of music, if you will. And we have to have rapid financing or rapid funding that delivers a sustained demand signal for high uplift, low cost projects. And one of the things that was really interesting to us, we took a lot of that work from Oregon, and we've now started to look at the Sacramento River Basin and the Central Valley in California. And we're working in partnership not only with the state and the city of Sacramento, but also a newcomer to the game, which is, in our case, it's Microsoft, who is seeking to be water, not neutral, but water positive, by 2030. And they are not engaging in the same old kind of greenwashing that has been, corporate sustainability in years past. It's really about, they have servers that we are now engaging, right? All across the region, the nation, and even the world. And many of these are in water-stressed basins. And what we looked at was, what is their first, best, and cheapest way to ensure that the steady state of water that those server farms need to continue to operate in a way that is cool enough for them to operate. And we took our analytics, we surveyed the millions of acres within the Sacramento River Basin pretty rapidly, and we were able to identify some great opportunities for them to go to work and do that. And so what was really interesting, and I think where it turned over for us, it's not just, they're not regulated to do this. They need to do this to operate, and that's important. And they also understand that their business operates within a broader social and watershed context. So what we were able to do is set them up to identify what they can do in terms of their part to make them successful. And they came back with the question, it'd be great is if rather than just taking care of our own little bit of this, what if we could get together a group of other like-minded, either technology or other corporations, and bring together a buyer's fund that could be a stack of funding that we can put on top of, the federal dollars and the state dollars and the community foundation dollars, so that we can amass enough work in enough places across an entire watershed to fix the whole watershed. And that represents to me, really the pathway of the future. It's not just sending more money down the grant pipes that currently exist.
Joe, the partnerships you're talking about, particularly with regard to a company the size of Microsoft and the impact they can have on the world, when we're investing, are we investing with multiple objectives in mind, including addressing social and economic justice?
We absolutely are. And, the opportunity that created, that partnership with Microsoft, we're looking first in the Sacramento River Valley and the Central Valley. And in the Central Valley of California, there are more people drinking more poisonous water due to agricultural runoff and nitrates in their wells than are drinking the same in Flint, Michigan. And they're in small, rural, disadvantaged communities. They have shallow water aquifers, which are the ones that get in trouble first when bad weather comes. And we actually shared this information, are working currently with EPA in their Office of Water at the highest levels, because they have great data, but it's not actionable. And so, in our world, if it's not actionable, who cares, right? And so they do have a great data set that we are now beginning to overlay so that we can pursue those, multiple variables. And the EJ layers that are gained via the census they can get better. So that conversation is happening. And what's really cool is we can see that now. We don't, in a very particular way, so that we can address how do we spend money and invite private capital in to get the greatest amount of social uplift, environmental uplift, and even economic benefit for the least amount of cost. And with regard to Microsoft, they're huge, except they have a very little sliver to do the things that we might want them to do. Otherwise, they have to use their money for, generating their engine. And, but what they have done is like, hey, here's where the conversation is. Hey, can we get some EPA money and some USDA money and some local foundation money and some other, private philanthropy, and then go out and build a buyer's fund with they and their tech super friends, so that we can begin to pursue something that looks a little bit more like a watershed commonwealth. And so it's actually really exciting, and it's very early days.
What I hear you saying, kind of a heavy emphasis on leveraging modern technology, analytics. We have the ability. This new era isn't all problems. The new era also means that we've got greater engineering capacity for solutions, and we should leverage that capacity. So that's kind of what I hear you saying, and I would say those principles seem very, very transferable to the other sectors that we're going to be addressing here, including eventually talking about Oregon's wildfire issues. So I think it's a great setup, great introduction, and a good segue to our next guest, which is Dean Takahashi with the Yale Carbon Containment Lab. I'll talk a little bit about what he sees as being the arc in climate change policy and maybe some lessons that we could learn there as well. So thanks, Dean.
Given the enormity of the problem with megafires, I think it's pretty clear that we need the involvement and the investment from the private sector. And with help from the public sector, the private sector can bring sort of a powerful combination of capital, jobs, and innovation. It's challenging, but it's possible. And I think if we look at the solar energy industry, you can see how that might work. It's really an excellent example of where the collaboration between the public and private sectors has worked. Many of us have been around long enough that we remember when solar energy was sort of like a gadget, something that was kind of cool, but it only worked on a very micro scale and made sense in sort of off the grid applications. But today, it's a completely different story. And the partnership between the government and the private sector played a key role in that success. The federal government has taken several steps to help develop the solar industry. Between 2008 and 2019, the Department of Energy provided $9.4 billion of R&D funding for renewable energy. The federal government also provided support for solar financing with tax credits and Recovery Act loan guarantees. And many states bolstered prices with renewable energy credits and renewable portfolio standards. And these efforts from the public sector have really paid off. If you think now, the cost of solar energy has dropped 70% over the past decade. Solar now represents the largest type of energy being added, and now is 43% of U.S. capacity additions. The U.S. investment in solar energy is around $25 billion, and now 250,000 Americans work in the solar industry. So I think if we think about that, I think that's a really good example of how by just resolving some of the technological risks and giving some assistance up front can really help get the private sector involved. And then, today that the innovation has brought down costs so much that you can see that the private sector can be contributing with solar and renewable energy on an ongoing, sustained basis. So if we can do that sort of thing, on carbon removal and carbon capture, that could be really powerful.
Yeah, that's very that's very encouraging, and I also remember kind of the gadget phase, and it always seemed like solar was, just around the corner. It was always just around the corner, and then major breakthroughs. And I really like Dean, how you talk about the specific role of the public sector, both at the federal level, kind of early stage R&D, and some of the risk mitigation measures to kind of create some level of certainty that to attract private capital, and then also those the support at the state level. Private sector is all about risk. I mean, this is what we do. This is what private investment is all about. So nobody's looking for like a zero risk situations. There is no such thing in terms of private investment. But there are types of risk that are acceptable and types of risks that are not acceptable, and market risk and operating risk and so forth. That's that's part of the game. But it's these kind of alignment risks that are less acceptable. And this is a really great place for the public sector to step in and demonstrate there is alignment. There is long-term alignment between what the private investors want and what the public wants. And so these kind of steps that you're talking about to de-risk this sector in those specific targeted ways just seems like a very great lesson.
Well, and if I might, Matt, I'd love to just bring this point out. When we look at the COVID pandemic and the dollars that were invested to come up with vaccinations, that's what we're talking about. The private sector got involved. There was governmental and federal and national support, and that support was nationwide and throughout the world because it was critical that we find a vaccination for COVID. And when we look at wildfire, we're all here representing Oregon, Washington, California. Wildfire is critical to our communities, and that's where the public-private partnership is so essential. We have to have that kind of partnership, that kind of investment, and that kind of risk. So I appreciate, Dean, you bringing that out. But it is comparable to how we addressed COVID as a world and as a nation. Wildfire in our states is that kind of critical issue, and we need that kind of response. So thanks, Dean, for your comments.
Bringing this down to the rural and the local, small businesses, landowners, and rural communities typically have a lower capacity to take on risk. The long-term cash flows that might be feasible for a larger investor or corporate entity can be difficult for a small farmer or forest landowner. And so that risk mitigation of the federal and state government, but also often the partnerships with local nonprofits help overcome that sort of smaller scale risk, but really substantial barrier to innovation and deployment of new technology in a rural place.
I guess the last thing before we shift over to Dan and hear a little bit about what's going on in California, it's this kind of this phased approach that Dean talked about, which is a very heavy investment on the front end through R&D and all these enabling policies, ultimately developed a glide path towards sustainability, dropped costs, that directly serves not only the planet through clean energy, but also consumers, affordable power. And all the job creation that Dean referenced, 250,000 jobs, and look at all that private investment that's flowing in. A great success story. The other thing I just mentioned is just the messiness of what Dean was describing there with kind of the early stage kind of gadget and so forth. I remember that, and that does feel a lot like what we see with carbon capture right now. Is folks that you got all the private, these corporate net zero, policies and so forth, and even Dean's, startup here at Yale is kind of a reflection of this. We got this world-class university, world-class research, and now what they're looking to do is build partnerships with multiple sectors, and the lab I think is an indicator of where we are in this kind of early stage, and hopefully with a path towards sustainability.
When Matt first asked me about carbon capture, it really gave me pause because it's really hard to sort of identify clear examples of success. On one hand, I'm very optimistic about carbon capture, but it's really early. The path isn't really clear for the private capital, and at least at scale, and the government support is really not consistent. And carbon capture can mean different things to different people, but I think we want to focus on natural systems such as trees that take in carbon dioxide from photosynthesis and store it in the carbon in the wood. Although trees are incredible store of carbon, there's really still significant risk and verification risks for the carbon credit markets. One issue is that particularly the issue of impact or additionality. Trees capture carbon, but should you get paid for not cutting down a tree that wasn't going to get cut down in the first place? Or if someone else harvests a different tree and supplies the mill instead? Those are really important questions. Another issue is the carbon storage in trees isn't permanent. Carbon credits are typically assessed according to the global warming over 100 years. And trees don't live forever. Some get stressed by drought and disease, and of course by fire. They die and decompose and return the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And if you think about the decline in demand for paper and traditional biomass power, that really accentuates the problem of excess fuel in the forest. But I think there's a real opportunity to utilize the value of the carbon in the small diameter trees that can bring financial resources to pay for mechanical thinning and relieve the pressure to harvest large fire-resistant trees that are really great at storing carbon. For this to happen at scale, however, forest landowners, particularly the largest one, the federal government, really need to be able to agree to long-term contracts that help assure businesses that they will have a reliable, sustainable supply of carbon from that wood over the long term, because they need to make those long-term commitments in building the facilities to take in that and treat that wood. One thing that's I'm pretty interested in and excited about are the opportunities where you can take the carbon from trees and sort of preserve or prevent it from decomposing and going back into the atmosphere. And I think this is where I'm particularly excited about bioenergy and carbon capture and storage, or BECCS. It's a really important system that it's still early in its development, but I think the technology works and demonstrations projects are really promising. There's several large-scale facilities in active development, and the reasonable costs are actually getting even lower. So when you think about more and more corporations and governments and nonprofit institutions such as Yale are committing to zero emission targets, it's pretty clear that they're unlikely to reach these by just cutting their emissions, that they're generating on their own. So I expect that the demand for carbon credits to offset those emissions is going to grow significantly. And there are precious few quality credits from projects that truly remove and store carbon. So I think we're going to see a lot of price pressure for reliable carbon credits, and that can dramatically increase the prices from their sort of single-digit levels today. So when you look forward, I think 45Q tax credits at $50 a ton for the CO2 that's injected into underground, low carbon fuel standards, and carbon credits, which I think will be at higher prices. It's going to help reflect the value of carbon, and it will help fund this carbon capture and storage industry. And what's critically important for Oregon is that these tax credits and price supports can bring in money from outside the state and help support forest restoration and dealing with wildfire risk. It also brings in good jobs, and helps fund efforts to help vulnerable communities, all the while sort of helping to fight climate change. So I'm excited about this, but compared to the solar story, we're really early still in that. But I think there's great potential.
That's fantastic. Very encouraging. And, plenty of themes that are directly applicable, obviously, but it seems like what I hear is kind of a need to really synthesize a very kind of cogent system that really takes advantage of this integration between climate and carbon, and again looking towards building a long-term sustainable system. Very, very early stage, but also very encouraging. So thanks, Dean. So next, we're going to talk about some of the innovation that's going on with our Western neighbors. We'll start by looking to the south and some innovation that we see underway down in California. So that'll turn it over to Dan Porter with the Nature Conservancy.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks for the discussion so far. There's so many parallels that the previous speakers have hit upon that in California, I feel like we are sort of at the forefront of, for better or worse, because we have a drier Mediterranean climate where, fire has shaped our forests for millennia, both natural and cultural fire. So at the Nature Conservancy, what we are attempting to accomplish over the course of the next 10 years or so is to set up the forest landscape so that it is healthy and more receptive to good fire, both in the form of prescribed fire and managed wildfire over time, so that it can sustain those systems. As many of you know, the current problem in California is pretty acute. We have pretty compelling scientific evidence that the size of wildfires have grown substantially, meaning the patches of forest where few trees survive and the soil is scorched down to nothing and then washes down into the rivers is growing over time. And that has all kinds of long-term consequences that we'll have to deal with both naturally and with respect to our water infrastructure. So these trends really hit home for the Nature Conservancy's California team in 2014 with the King Fire. It was 100,000 acres, almost 100,000 acres of fire in the American River Basin. And much of it was high severity, of the type that I just described, and caused considerable damage. The cleanup has been very, very expensive. Since that time, we've had a mega drought. We've had a huge tree mortality event where we've lost over 150 million trees statewide. And this has caused our state and federal partners and the Nature Conservancy to really start to reconcile with this question of how do we scale forest restoration? How do we get it to a landscape scale as quickly as possible? So myself and my California colleagues have set up 3 signature projects. One is an implementation project called the French Meadows Project, where we work with Placer County Water Agency and Placer County. The second is a 275,000 acre planting project called the North Yuba Forest Partnership. And again, working with agencies, investors, local contractors to plan and implement forest restoration at that scale. And then finally, we have a scientific assessment where we're literally defining what resilience means for the 2.4 million acre Tahoe Central Sierra Initiative area, which is just west of Lake Tahoe. And as you can imagine, each of these efforts involves a multitude of partners, contributions from private partners, private philanthropy, as well as corporate philanthropy to push our efforts forward. Our overall approach is guided by science and a healthy dose of humility to guide our interventions on the ground. We also use policy advocacy to try to recreate or create the enabling conditions so that others may easily repeat the work and the successes that we're experiencing. And our goal, no surprise, is to really restore the character of the older forests that we found before they were logged and before fire was suppressed, including the reintroduction, as I mentioned, of low intensity fires and preparing the landscape to receive even more fire. But given the state of our forests today, it's simply unsafe to introduce fire as a first entry. And so we really are forced to rely on the mechanical removal of small trees to make the environment safe for prescribed fire and managed wildfire. The good news is the scientific support is among stakeholders and scientists is nearly unanimous around the methods which we collectively call ecological forestry, which involves strategic thinning of small trees and the use of good fire. But the work is really expensive, and there are very few markets, as Dean mentioned earlier, that actually can make use of the small diameter material. It's almost a valueless commodity. We've also experienced quite a reduction in the wood processing infrastructure in California over the years, to the point now where current processing is matched, pretty much to the private land base, and there's not much in the way of wood processing capacity for the extensive federal land base. In contrast, the need in California is huge. There's over 9 million acres of forest in degraded condition that have been identified. And in response to the need, the last 2 governors have issued executive orders to help remedy the situation. The most recent governor has committed $1 billion in funding to address the problem. And the U.S. Forest Service has set a goal of 500,000 acres of treatment, inclusive of thinning, wildfire, prescribed fire, every year by 2030 for the next 20 years. That's a huge commitment. They've made it very clear that ecosystem restoration is their North Star for that work. So the big question becomes, how do we get there? It's a huge, huge challenge. From the perspective of the on-the-ground work that I mentioned, meeting that ambitious goal will require a cross-sector collaboration, unlike we've ever seen before in forestry. We're going to need massive evolutions in technology, in how we intervene on behalf of nature and how we measure and determine whether or not we're being effective. And all of this has to occur, of course, in a reasonable amount of time and at a feasible cost to society. So that's why last year we partnered with Bain & Company, which is a leading business consultant in the US. And we asked Bain to basically help us understand the different end markets that might use small diameter trees. They found that basically almost all the new products, the gasification, pyrolysis, had technical or supply chain challenges that were significant enough to mean that deploying those technologies today, right now, is probably not possible at the scale that we need it to be possible, right? In other words, we need to move a massive amount of small diameter material off the landscape. And a lot of these technologies are going from the bench to the demonstration phase and haven't been fully commercialized yet. So what they ended up recommending, which is a really interesting idea and one that we're working hard on, is to actually link and improve the synergies in existing technologies, such as small log milling and bioenergy conversion, and siting these new, what we call integrated campuses, close to the forest restoration sites, thereby reducing the overall transportation costs. We think that this approach could really help with essentially what is a disposal problem, but could also serve as centers of innovation where the energy and the raw material is consolidated and provides the power and the infrastructure in order to innovate and create more nascent future forest solutions like the one that I mentioned.
I have to jump in here because my head's just about to explode. I mean, these are big problems and they need big answers. But, just because the feds say they want to treat some acres, that's great. I mean, certainly we want them to do that. I would argue we want them to do that faster than even what they're purporting they're going to do that. But it's not just about treating acres. It's about actually getting to the outcomes of we're not having catastrophic wildfire anymore, right? What do we have to do to do that? That's when we can begin to design to the problem. And, what's really interesting is this situational awareness that we're beginning to understand where our world is. And, I talked about stacking the values, right? There are different things that we can do, certainly from a scientific perspective, but, we can also begin to deliver social outcomes. And you can begin to invite in different colors of money, folks that are, you've got people that are interested in wildfire. Yeah, you've got people that are interested in water for agriculture. You got people that are interested in water for communities. You've got people that are interested in, equity around disadvantaged communities. And we can set the pricing up so that premiums are paid for those things that we now want as a society. And it's it starts with the outcome in mind, and then we design to that outcome.
There's the economics and the money and the business side of it, right, which you were speaking to. And then there's the practice side of it. And I think what we need is actually to stack those both dimensions creatively so that we're working both with the best, business finance tools that we know, and also working with the best land management practices that we know how to use: thinning, prescribed fire, manage wildfire. Because frankly, in California, much of the area is going to burn irrespective of what we do. That much is pretty clear. And so it's more a matter of what is the balance of letting fire go in backcountry areas where doing so, doesn't threaten people and property. Where can we use prescribed fire intentionally to really set up the landscape? And then how does thinning really set the stage for that? And that's the point where we're at. So I agree with you. It's a very rich, interesting space, and we need all hands on deck.
Yeah, I will say, I'm eager to jump into this as well. I'm very eager to hear from Nils and what he's learning about up here in the Northwest.
It's been an exciting and intriguing conversation for me, having worked on a lot of these issues for 22 years now in Northeast Oregon, and really sort of thinking about it with respect to the larger Intermountain West, and then also working with community leaders across the West through Rural Voices for Conservation Coalition. So working closely also with groups in Northern California, and everything you've said, Dan, rings home to me. But that the other part of this is kind of thinking about the kind of competitive, the evolution between states, the true sort of demonstration of the learning labs of our democratic system here and state system, where Oregon was one of the early leaders in responding to federal forest health issues and wildfire issues back with the Federal Forest Restoration Program in 2012, 2013. And now to see, California and Washington leap out ahead, both in terms of the financial commitment, the bipartisan consensus around action, and then this innovation from policy to practice and public-private investment in the infrastructure, technology, workforce development that's needed to get this done. But a lot of that, even that reference you made, Dan, to integrated campuses, we've been working on integrated campuses in Northeast Oregon since 2005, and have a very small example of that in the company Heartwood Biomass in the town of Wallowa. So it's just exciting to see. And looking to the north now, Matt, as you asked, we've got the state has just committed to $125 million of new investment through DNR, through their forest health program. It's actually being built into their operating budget, so it's intended to be a long-term investment. It is taking advantage of additional funds available, post COVID and with economic stimulus coming from the federal government. But clearly the signal is a recognition this is a large problem and needs a long-term commitment, and therefore they're embedding this new funding directly into the operating budget of DNR. And it's structured to address many things that Dan spoke to. It's clearly investing in the forest landscape resilience issue. It's also investing in wildland-urban interface, thinning and defensible space, and home hardening to protect homes, families, and those communities living on the interface of the forest. But it's also committing resources to get more fire suppression resources, recognizing that that this problem is increasing in scale, as you said in your and frequency and severity, as you said in your introduction, and that's going to happen moving into the future. And so the historic pattern where states and even countries, including Australia and Canada, have shared resources, shared aerial, suppression resources and crews, that's becoming harder and harder because we're seeing more frequent large fires across all of these states and countries happening on a recurring basis, and so they don't actually have the capacity to help each other as much as they used to, and therefore the state of Washington is boosting the resources that they have direct control over and own. As they look at these landscape priority areas, and they're using really sophisticated analysis, similar to what Joe talked about on the water side in California, to understand risk and understand how to reduce that risk, both to forest values, but also to homes and households and families and other sort of community and economic values. They're putting 75% of the weighting on the large landscape forest resilience factors, 25% on the homes, creating these landscape prioritization maps, creating this integrated strategy of protecting houses, but also doing that forest resilience work. And in every landscape, that range of what they think needs to be treated is sort of between 35 and 50% of those watersheds need that intervention that Dan spoke about, again, sort of primarily reducing the high numbers of small diameter trees that are leading, that create the continuity, both the horizontal and vertical continuity of fuels that we need to break up. The other part that's exciting about in California, obviously in the Northeast, up around Spokane, Colville, there's been good partnerships with the private sector to bring some new wood processing capacity online. Good partnerships came out early, sort of following the 2015 fires. That really spurred Washington into action and brought that consensus there. And quickly out of the gate in that Colville area, sort of agreements between community leaders, Native American tribes, environmental leaders about the priorities for treatment, priorities for protection, and then the need for new processing facilities like Bog Timbers and their mass timber facility that went in there. And then you have on the Gifford Pinchot, sort of that they're really emerging now through forest leadership and local community leadership, with a lot of strength around that consensus about where and how to treat, but also increased reliance on community partners to provide pre-sale crews, because the Forest Service is short of staff and resources. So they're deploying private sector crews to do pre-sale work, unit marking and layout, tree marking, et cetera, all to help build that scale and capacity to get this work done.
Yeah, that's really very powerful there, Nils. And just one point of clarification here, Dan. We talk about this all lands approach with regard to forest restoration and wildfire mitigation. And so the 500,000 acre figure, it's my understanding in California, that's just federal land, right? And then there's another 500,000 acre of non-federal land. So the total restoration goal for the state is actually 1 million acres per year, is my understanding. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. Our current program is focusing on the federal lands, but the aggregate target is 1 million acres. So all the need I mentioned before times 2.
Yeah. So in terms of, it's my understanding there's a shared stewardship agreement between the state and the federal agencies, and it's the 1 million acres that everybody's kind of rallying around, 500,000 coming from the federal ownership, but then significant non-federal component, and then really trying to harness the state resources, the federal resources, the private investment, kind of around this 1 million acre kind of target, which is even that much greater a challenge. But also just a lot of state supporting policies, already, being affected to do that. And kind of in a similar vein, Nils, also up in Washington, kind of this all lands approach, also setting specific objectives and then kind of building the organizational resources, including, we've talked about it here, workforce capacity. If you're going to look to the private sector to actually play a role, there needs to be a private sector, and there needs to be, a workforce that's being thoughtfully cultivated through our education system and training, and so forth.
And I'd say, Matt, too, I mean, that other point that Joe highlighted in terms of Dan's, in terms of what's happening in California, that's really key to that workforce development is sort of this long-term planning and commitment to invest and do more work. And if there was the confidence and consistency in that, the private sector is going to respond with investments, with training. And I think that's probably, particularly in Oregon, or at least in parts of Oregon, Eastern Oregon, that's a significant barrier, is still, given the history and all the uncertainty surrounding forest management, and all the aspects that we've talked about today, that uncertainty creates a barrier to investment.
That's a really great point, Nils. And I would say, as we look at, the water example that Joe talks about, and the solar example that Dean provided and so forth, this is an area where it's perhaps unique and in many ways kind of challenging when you talk about forest restoration and wildfire, because in other sectors, there might be kind of more of this phased approach with a very significant component of the public sector up front, which kind of a glide path more towards, the private sector eventually kind of taking over. In this case, kind of a feature of this is that, the federal land is so significant. 60% of the land, the forest land here in Oregon, like 93% of the acres that burn are burned on federal property. And so our long-term strategy must, envision the federal government as being a long-term partner. Now, it can still, a lot of that kind of early stage support still, applies here, the team is talking about with solar and so forth, to get the market up and running. But any business case has got to imagine that the federal government's going to be a key partner for decades to come. And so we have to bring this certainty that you're talking about, kind of de-risk this, Nils, envisioning the fact that, the federal government's going to be a key partner over the long term.
Yeah, well, I think there are several stages to formally and properly addressing almost any problem of any size. And, the first step is having situational awareness. Situational awareness is actually a flying term where you have a lot of variables in play at once, and you have to make good decisions first by understanding what the heck is going on. And what's really great now, what's changed, I think, in the American mind is the fact that things are bad, right? This whole megafire it's not something that happens way out away from them. It's like people with asthma are having worse problems and they're in town. I mean, neighborhoods are burning down. And so what we need to do is once we all agree, hey, we got a problem, and I think we're there, then the next thing is like, okay, what's our outcome, right? And once you have the outcome, if you put a face on your outcome, then you begin to innovate. And once you begin to innovate, you can track your progress towards success and ultimately generate the gains that are not just environmental, but also economic. And so at the outset, you have to design an integrated outcome that's based on prosperity. So many of the problems that we're addressing now are based on a design that was focused on maximal outcomes and maximal averages, like maximal board feet, instead of an optimal outcome, which contemplates things like, how's the community doing? How are the school revenues looking? How is the water supply doing for for all parts of the community to be able to have, access to good, clean drinking water. And, so a lot of the things, if you look at a theory of change, any theory of change, right, you go through this, it's a continuum, right? First, you have to conceive of something that's possible, and then you have to go out and demonstrate that something is possible. And then once it's possible, then you go, let's encourage that. And once that gets encouraged, then you ultimately can require it if it's proven to do a good job. And then ultimately you have a new standard operating procedure. And that's where we need to get to. So many of the approaches that are in play here with forest management and the rest of it are, they're at various stages there. And so what we have to do is drive all of these things together so that it's much more of a gathering that is pursuing a kind of a higher, better outcome than we've seen before, one that contemplates a lot more aspects than it has contemplated in the past. And unless you do that, you're kind of headed for another reckoning. So I think this is doable. I don't think it's easy. But I know that it's doable. And we have to line up on that. And, that's where, my hope is that's what, all of these episodes are leading to, so that we can line up on the real problem with real stuff that's going to work. And we're in a bit of a hurry at this point.
Yeah. Well, I'd just say, Joe, I think you're exactly right. And I see Dean has a comment here. I guess one thing I would just say is, bringing the perspective of the Wildfire Council into the conversation. One of the big findings, that we had was, my gosh, the comprehensive costs of these wildfires is so much greater than what we typically think of. We think about how much did we pay the firefighters? How much, lost timber, home structures and things like that. The research shows that there's like multiples, like on average 11x what those near term, that is the long-term ecosystem degradation and degradation of communities and health impacts and so forth. And we're just getting our minds around this, and to say, okay, if you start avoiding those kinds of catastrophic costs and can start creating incentives to avoid those costs by making these investments and building the stack that you're talking about, that would, and just to Dean's earlier point, that integrates climate, all these emissions. That was something that we heard about from one of our earlier guests was, my gosh, the emissions coming off of these catastrophic fires are so unnatural and so much greater, and they're contributing so much carbon. So you start building this stack of values that's fairly extensive here, right, including social justice. And we, Joe, just flat out don't yet have the analytics that you're describing. We're in a very, very early stage. I think that is a very key role that the public sector can play, is helping to, invest in the research and the analytics to drive those markets.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of echo the point about carbon values and make sure that gets added to the stack of sort of values in the federal forest. If you think about all the mortality rates in many of these areas that are really stressed forests, it really detracts from the ability of forests on a sort of a national level. The U.S. greenhouse gas inventory is really a reflection of the primary growth of the trees, but you subtract out the mortality, and that mortality is basically also wood that's going to be decomposing and becoming emissions. And so to get healthier forests that are more resilient is really very much in the federal, in the U.S., the nation's interests. And if we can get that, those values sort of into the market where they're, as opposed, so that private industry has a, incentive to deal with it correctly, it can really add huge amount of resources to, dealing with the issues of making healthier, more fire-resistant forests.
I've got a specific question to, I'm thinking specifically Nils, you, Joe, folks that, Dan, that have got this cross-sector kind of experience here. One of the takeaways for me on the Wildfire Council is we had Oregon Health Authority, we had, land use. We had, firefighting and agencies, and they all kept saying, boy, we've never been together in the same room on this conversation. And once this council goes away, we're going to go back to work because we got busy day jobs. And sure enough, I would say the council hasn't, met, and we're not having those integrated discussions. And so in the context of what Dean's talking about here and what we're all talking about here, which is integrated, multiple stacks, multiple values, how do we, as a state, how do we organize around this? And particularly given that the federal government plays such a role, what do you see needs to be done to kind of create this integrated response that we all know is necessary?
Yeah, Matt, I'll take a stab at that first. I think to your earlier point about, forming durable partnerships with the U.S. Forest Service, I think part of what we need is to really invent new governance structures side by side with the development of the stack that Joe was describing and I was describing, because those new governance structures, those new entities, whatever they might be, frameworks, are really, I think, the only way that the efforts can be sustained. And there's some legislation that's being considered in California right now that would take a step in that direction. It would essentially try to establish a regional program, because obviously California is a very big state, where the information and the investment and the governance and relationships are all developed within region with some, higher level guidance from the state and federal entities. But it would be really those regional organizations that are responsible for bringing all the nuts and bolts together and sustaining the effort. I think, on a personal level, it makes a lot, just given my work in different regions, the North Coast and the Sierra, I think it makes a lot of sense. It's a proposal that has the support of our Secretary of Natural Resources, Wade Crowfoot, and we're hoping it goes forward.
Yeah, I think two things are helping to drive integration, sort of two forces, and then the wildfires, and sort of the focal point that they provide to public and political and business attention, as well as an increased understanding of the different prosperities of urban and rural places. And there's and rural places have been lagging for decades, and that differential increased dramatically after the Great Recession of 2007, 2008. And I think collectively these things are beginning to drive some of that integration, as well as just sort of as the fires occur, a recognition that this is not the same old timber war debate. This is not a debate just between people that want to use the forest or protect the forest or have a strong affinity, and rightly so, to the forest, the wonderful forests of Oregon and the old growth that we have, because wildfires are impacting people's health through smoke, loss of property, loss of lives. They're affecting the quality and quantity of water available, not just for agriculture and human consumption, but also for salmon restoration. They're affecting wildlife habitat. They're affecting a whole range of things. And the opportunity then to move from this negative condition to improve forest health and create rural jobs, and as Dean is speaking about, innovate around carbon capture and sequestration in the process, is critical. Because if we don't, there's this cascade of events. One of the things that is very stark in rural communities now is as power companies try to limit their risk and are implementing preemptive blackouts, if a community is trying to protect health through safe smoke spaces using electric powered air purifiers, all these things get cut off. And, and so there's all these things that we all need to recognize and wrestle with, and therefore use to focus our attention on a collective response, like is happening in Washington and California, where they've moved beyond some of the partisan and stakeholder differences that still prevail in Oregon, and they're united on an approach, and hopefully that can motivate us here in Oregon.
I just want to say, as time goes on, and we continue to kind of learn and engage tools and tactics that are usable in other parts of our economy. Time's come now to kind of get past, this prologue of, well, it's just the way that each generation has done it before, so we don't have to really examine that. We can just kind of keep on doing this at the same pace or in the same manner. And that's just false. And we have to line up on that in order to move forward at this point. So I really appreciate this dialogue. Really love what the World Forestry Center is doing to sort of ask the question and drive the answer. And I remain confident that we're going to get there. We don't have any other choice.
Within Oregon and even across borders between Oregon and Washington, there's more and more sort of local and regional collaboration that I think is signs of hope, including the Northern Blues All Land Shared Stewardship Partnership that's working across Northeast Oregon, Southeast Washington, public, private, tribal landowners and organizations working to restore 10 million acres of the Northern Blues. And build a common vision for that, and integrate, as we've talked about here, both the integrated approach to landscape management that includes natural ignitions in the backcountry, forest resilience treatments, and WUI defensible space work, but also the workforce development, the development of new products and markets, and in that capacity, the pilot that the Yale Carbon Capture Project is working on is a really exciting new piece that would really complement and contribute to what's happening in the Northern Blues.
Just quickly, I want to thank all the panelists, and I have to give a nod to Dan. I'm a fellow TNCer serving on the Oregon TNC board, and I love the fact that, as I expected you would, you emphasize the word science. Everything we're doing is based on study of history and scientific evidence. And Nils, great to have you again. The fact that we're talking about treatments of 35% to 50% of high-risk forest land, I think is critical. And when we talk about treating or restoring forest lands, we're talking about public safety. And clearly, we've all emphasized the need to address public safety from the perspective of residents, with an emphasis on, BIPOC and disadvantaged, economically challenged populations. It's a common theme. It's public safety, it's social justice, it's economic justice, it's environmental justice. So, Joe, you and Dean have connected the dots in a way that make it clear we have solutions, we have opportunity, but it's going to require partnership, and it's going to require long-term commitment in those partnerships. And it's significant dollars, but the return will be addressing issues in multiple areas. And I think that's the strong point we have to always raise. It is a multiple outcome effort. People will focus on wildfire and the forest, but we're talking about all of those justice issues that I just mentioned. So thank you very much for your very insightful contributions, and look forward to talking with each of you in the future.
I think the thing I'm walking away with today is it is not far off that we all share a common desire, and that is to solve this issue. I think, sure, there may be different approaches or different ways in which we feel like we should get to that end goal. But I think Joe and Nils' conversation particularly really hit the nail on the head for me. It's exciting to see that both private and public and nonprofit entities share the same goal in achieving an integrated outcome that will result in the betterment for everybody. that's not common. And so I'm thankful for that, and hopeful that on this journey to solving this issue, we can unite together and in long-term commitment achieve that integrated outcome that we're looking for.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I guess just my last words would be I found Dean's example of energy and solar and that evolution to be very encouraging, because I remember it very well. And to see kind of those patterns playing out in carbon capture, it's also encouraging because we can do this. And I found, Dan and Nils, your comments about frankly the other states kind of racing ahead of us, because we were and Oregon was and it still is recognized as a pioneer for particularly in collaboratives. And to see our neighboring states building so constructively is very, very encouraging. And I would add, I think, Joe, your comments around optimization versus maximization are spot on. I think that if you really look at the evolution, particularly with regard to forest restoration, I mean, so much of our early focus on natural resource management was fairly narrowly focused. And as we've, broadened to more and more multiple uses, it's become more complex. And now what we're talking about is adding on values really with regard to integrating on climate, and then really integrating on social justice and looking at the social values at stake. And so you're talking about a very, very complex exercise, and yet there really doesn't seem to be an alternative. This is the fact. There's so much at stake. There's so many values at stake. And if you look at the work of the Wildfire Council, I mean, it was the forecast running into the tens of billions of dollars in the years ahead, just here in Oregon. And so, the cost of inaction vastly outweigh the cost of action. And so we have to figure this out. The good news is we've got a lot of success stories to build off of. We've got a lot of technology. We've got a lot of advanced analytics. And as Joe was telling us, it's doable. So I'm just really, really so thankful for everybody that came together. My co-host as always, and this panel. I just can't thank you enough for your time. And continuing this conversation and continuing our work together. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Matt.
All right. Take care.
Take care.